All the Young Dudes by MsKingBean89, Chapter 126, 7th Year, Christmas Part 3. Monday, 2nd January 1978. The next week and a half was one of the darkest Remus could remember. When Mrs. Potter finally arrived home the day after the attack, she was white and drawn and hugged her family so tight as if she had thought she would never see them again. "About 50 dead, so I've heard," she said solemnly. "I was mostly triage, though. Hundreds wounded." Any of us?" Mr. Potter asked. He looked as though he hadn't slept in hours, and indeed, as far as Remus knew, he had not been to bed either. Euphemia nodded, closing her eyes. "Later," she said, casting a glance at the boys. James looked indignant. "We can hear it," he said. "We're all of age, and we were there when it happened." "Yes, I know you were," Mrs. Potter shouted, her voice shrill. James's mouth snapped shut, and he looked down, ashamed. Mrs. Potter got up. "I'm going for a lie down." She left the room, and the men sat in silence. "Sorry, Dad," James mumbled. "It's all right." Fleamont removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "We're all upset. Your mother and I need you boys to listen and do as you're told until it's time to go back to school. Do you understand?" They all nodded, reluctantly, and Remus saw the muscles in Sirius's jaw tighten. It was a mark of his respect for Mr. Potter that he did not protest. "Now," Fleamont continued, "this house is going to be very busy for the next few days, and you're going to see a lot of very important people doing very important work. Do not ask too many questions, and do not make nuisances of yourselves." "Can't we help?" James asked, earnestly. "Yes," Fleamont nodded, "by being gracious host and minding your mother." "Yes, Dad," James sighed, looking down again, obviously disappointed. "James," Fleamont began, reaching over to touch his son's arm. Remus and Sirius took that as their cue to clear the table and waited around in the kitchen, half-heartedly helping Gully do the washing up. "I don't see what the fuss is about," Sirius grumbled, elbow deep in soap suds. "If they knew half the things we were capable of, we can actually help." "We'll have our chance," Remus replied, staring out of the window as he dried the plates. The garden was very dark, and a chill mist hung in the air, making it difficult to see much beyond the patio wall. He could just make out James's quitter tubes on the lawn and the dim, waning moon. He didn't like not being able to see very far. It made him uneasy. "That's all right for you to say," Sirius was still complaining. "You've already proved yourself." "What?" Remus glanced up at him, confused and momentarily distracted from the window. "With that werewolf you met last year. You've already faced the enemy and shown Dumbledore he can trust you." "I don't think I explained that properly, if that's what you think," Remus said. "Livia it wasn't about the wall. Dumbledore thinks it was. Moody does. They talk about the werewolves all the time. How useful you've been trying to convince the dark creatures not to join you-know-who. Can we talk about something else?" "Fine." They talked about nothing. They did the dishes in complete silence. Remus stared out the window into the blackness of the Potter grounds and looked for something. Finally, James came in, just as they finished putting away the last of the china. "All right, mate?" Sirius asked, cheerily. "Yeah," James shrugged, looking somehow wiser. Older. "Just dad stuff, you know." Sirius and Remus glanced at each other, and Remus knew they were both experiencing the same sour envy. What did it mean to have a father like Fleamont Potter? To have one at all? "I said I'd give Lily a ring, if you two fancy to walk into the village." "Why not?" Sirius said, leaving the dish rag over the tap. "Oh, Moony, Dad said to give you this." James handed over a small scroll of paper. Remus opened it quickly, glancing over the neat name and address written there. James cocked his head, curious. "What is it?" "Oh, nothing. Book I was asking about." Remus stuffed it into his pocket. "Come on, calls are cheaper after 6. James had finally learned how to use a phone box unaided, so there was nothing for Remus to do but lean against the fence next to Sirius, waiting. He rolled cigarettes to pass the time He'd cut the fingers off his gloves back in November for explicitly this purpose. "I didn't mean you," Sirius said, quietly, "when I said dark creatures." "I know you didn't." Remus licked the Rizzler, then smoothed it down. He handed the completed cigarette to Sirius, who took it and put it behind his ear. Remus began another one. "Gotta teach me how to do that Monday," Sirius murmured, watching him appreciatively. "I bet we could work out a spell to do it instantly." "Probably," Remus sighed, lining up tobacco, "but I like doing it this way." "Fair enough." They were quiet again. Remus finished his second one and held it between his thumb and forefinger, wondering whether or not to smoke it. Mrs. Potter didn't like the smell on them, and he hated to add to her troubles. But on the other hand, he could really use something to calm his nerves. Sirius could chew, if the constant tapping of his leg was anything to go by. He was chewing his fingernails too. Remus lit the cigarette with a snap of his fingers, and inhaled. Sirius followed suit, his legs stilled. "I am, though," Remus said, on an exhale. "What?" "A dark creature, like you said." "Moony, no." "Yep," Remus nodded, gazing out at the fields before them and the motorway behind that. "So when you talk about wanting to prove yourself, I do understand what you mean. People trust werewolves just about as much as they trust the disgraced sons of dark wizards." "I do know. I didn't mean to act like you're the only one with a stake in this war." "Yeah, like that. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "I know," Remus smiled, looking at him finally. "I'm sorry about Regulus." "Well," Sirius scuffed his feet in the gravel, "I already knew, pretty much. Of course he was there." "I'm going to work so hard on this Slytherin prank when we get back to school. It'll be my best work." Sirius laughed, an honest, abandoned noise, throwing his head back. "Godric, Moony." He grinned broadly. "When you say things like that, it just makes me want to snog your face off." Remus snorted. He shot a look at James inside the red phone box, jabbering away with a huge smile on his face. "Maybe not just yet." Sirius looked mournful again. "I'm going to tell him, just not with all this bad stuff going on, you know?" "I know," Remus nodded. He did. He didn't want Sirius to know it. The idea of James finally finding out about them was much scarier than he had prepared himself for. Why shake everyone up again? "Remus, if I ask you something, will you tell me the truth?" "Okay." His stomach clenched involuntarily, but he steeled himself. "What was the note from James's dad? It wasn't a book title, was it?" "No," Remus agreed. "It wasn't." He reached inside his pocket and pulled it out, thumbing the soft, thick parchment for a moment before handing it over to Sirius. Sirius unfolded it quickly and looked down. "Hope Jenkins?" he read, a crease in his brow. "What does that mean?" "It's a name," Remus said, quickly. "My mother's name, and an address." "Oh," Sirius breathed, rereading it, still frowning. "Your mother?" He said the word as if he had never even considered the possibility that Remus had such a thing. "Yeah," Remus took the parchment back, shoving it back into his pocket. "I know we said we would talk about anything but mothers, but, well, Dumbledore gave me a letter she'd written me, back after Lyle died. She said I could try to find her when I was of age, so Mr. Potter found her, I suppose." "What are you going to do with it? Write to her?" "Yeah, I think I will." Sirius moved his hand on the fence, subtly brushing Remus's fingers. "Well, I hope you find her." Mr. Potter had been right. For the next few days, the house was busier than Remus had seen it since the Christmas party of '73. Except, of course, there was very little cheer. These were the people closest to Dumbledore. Many of them were working for the ministry, but all of them were loyal to him before anything else. They were the front line in the war effort. Some of them were familiar faces. Moody, of course, who usually spared the time to cast a gruff nod at the three teenage boys, who were now spending their days watching the fireplace for new arrivals. Then there was Frank Longbottom himself, just as pleasant and good-natured as Remus remembered. He came through most often with his girlfriend, Alice, the young woman who had ushered Sirius and Remus back on the day of the attack. The Pruitt twins were another surprise. James and Sirius were falling over themselves to catch up with them and share every nefarious act they had committed at Hogwarts since the older boys' departure. They had both grown very handsome, broad-shouldered, and rough around the edges from a few adventures, but they still had the same easy tempers and wicked sense of humour. Often they brought their red-haired sister and her equally flame-haired husband. All of these guests only stopped to chat a few moments to James, Remus and Sirius before vanishing into Mr. Potter's study, or else heading out to the garden to apparate. Apparently Moody had placed a charm over the Potter's house, making it not only unplottable, but impossible to place an apparition trace on. As a consequence, the living room and entrance hall began to feel very much like platform 9 3/4. In the evenings, Mrs. Potter would come home, looking worn out and determined. She would still have a smile for everyone and be ready to host whoever was in the house for supper. She was nothing short of spectacular. The night before the boys were expected to return to Hogwarts, Moody, Frank and Alice were joining them for dinner, beef stew with dumplings. They were having a very pleasant evening. Frank and Remus were having a very intense discussion about defensive charms, and Alice and the boys, including Fleamont, were arguing over which Quidditch team was going to win the league. To Remus's left, Moody leaned over to address Mrs. Potter and whispered, "I hear Ferrex is getting out tomorrow." "Getting out?" Remus spun around, cutting Frank off mid-flow. "Getting out of where?" Moody raised an eyebrow, making his eerie magical eye bulge grotesquely. "Bloody good hearing you've got, lad. Make a good aura." Remus shook his head impatiently. "Professor Ferrex?" "Yes, dear," Euphemia explained, calmly. "Leo Ferrex was injured in the attack on Diagon Alley. He's now stable and will be going to stay with his grandmother for a while to recuperate fully. I'm sorry, I quite forgot he taught at Hogwarts. Did you know him well?" "Sort of. He was my favourite teacher," Remus said, his insides churning. "Is he... What happened? Was he in one of the shops?" "He was on the ground, in the battle with us," Frank said. "He was in the thick of it. You couldn't fault his technique. He was firing spells better than anyone, but we all get unlucky sometimes." "But he'll be all right." Remus put his fork down now. He wasn't going to eat any more. "With proper rest," Mrs. Potter nodded, smiling wanly. All of the terror Remus had been trying to ignore for the past few days came crashing back. He gripped the seat of his chair and stared at his plate and thought about Ferrex, lying unconscious in the rubble. A good, strong man like that, shot down. Remus felt a stab of angry defiance in his gut, sharpening his focus. He was going to do better, no matter what it took. He was going to be quicker, braver. The next time the battle came to him, he would be ready.